Hello everybody, how are we doing today? It's time for some reading. How are we doing? I changed my setup a little bit, so hopefully my sight lines don't look too weird, but I have my chat now here, even though on the screen it's obviously over there, but I have my chat here and I'll of course like read over here, but I hope you guys are doing well. Thank you so much for the host hammer. Mayonnaise definitely counts as an instrument. And it's good to see you as well, Celeste. Hi, Timo. How are you guys doing? Yeah, I'm just taking advantage of the last day off I'll probably have in a really long time. And I'd like to get some streaming in, so that's what we're going to do. So we are obviously reading the book that Curse of Blackmore Manor, which is Nancy Drew game number 11, is based off of. And so far, we have not even made it to England. We're a third of the book in. We read 6 chapters. We're going to read 6 more. And we are not even to England yet. And Nancy has already basically discovered that she has a crush. She still hasn't had his boyfriend, but she has a crush on a British rock star. And somebody has slipped cocaine in Nancy's purse. This is a wild book. And so far, I'm not seeing many, connections to the game. But anyway. So that being said, I hope that you guys are having a great day. We're going to just jump right into Chapter 7. And of course, hopefully you guys can still hear the music okay, but it's not overpowering or too quiet. Just let me know if you need me to adjust anything. But I'm going to go ahead and jump in. Hey, Steph, how are you? Oh, sounds like a plan, Celeste. Good luck with that. Chapter 7. Surprise Meeting. Timing, thought Nancy, was everything. Later, she wondered how differently her whole adventure in England might have turned out if she hadn't chanced to pass that particular door at Heathrow Airport at that particular moment. Her transatlantic flight had been smooth and uneventful. She had read Wicca, The Way of Wisdom, until she dozed off around 11 p.m. When she awoke, daylight was seeping in the curtained window, and the thought uppermost in her mind was Sergeant Weintraub's remark about the bag of cocaine that someone had slipped into her handbag. Had someone deliberately tried to bring about her arrest on a narcotics charge? Her musing ended when the stewardess served breakfast. Nancy dismissed the unpleasant subject from her mind as she ate and chatted with the Japanese electronic salesman sitting next to her. Presently, the pilot announced over the intercom that the plane was approaching London. 20 minutes later, the passengers were disembarking into Terminal 3. Heathrow struck Nancy as the biggest, busiest, most confusing, most sprawling airport she had ever passed through. There seemed to be a large number of young people and news cameramen everywhere she looked. The corridors seemed interminable, and one of the moving walkways had broken down. But the passport inspection was conducted with typical British courtesy, and her luggage was simply waved through Her Majesty's Customs with a cheery smile of welcome. Nancy was pushing a cart through what she hoped was the final corridor leading to the terminal exit when a voice called out, "Oi there, Red!" No one at home ever called her that. Her hair shone too lustrously golden for such a monochromatic nickname. Besides, why would any Cockney be hailing Nancy Drew? Curiosity turned her head nevertheless. A door had just opened, and a face was grinning out at her from a room off the corridor. It was Freddie Isham, the Crowned Heads bass player. "Stone the crows! What you doing here in England, lovey?" Freddie was a jolly, hulking teddy bear with a swarthy touch of West Indian blood, easily the most good-natured and likable of the group. "Just landed. What does it look like?" Nancy grinned back, pointing to her luggage cart. Freddie reached his big paw out to draw her into the room. "I was having a deco for our chauffeur, and look who turned up," he announced proudly. "Blimey, you must be telepathic," chortled Bobo Evans. He and Adam Muir enthusiastically welcomed the American teenager. The room seemed full of helmeted policemen. They were obviously preparing to buck the crowd of fans and escort the crowned heads out of the terminal as soon as their limousine was in position at the door. Nancy suddenly understood why she had seen all those young people and news cameramen drifting so expectantly about the airport. Then her eyes fell on Lance Warwick, and her heart flipped. There was no mistaking the glint in his eyes. He wasn't just turning on the charm for another groupie, he was genuinely delighted to see her. "Nancy, me old love," he cried and pushed past several bobbies to enfold her in his arms. "Whoa, hey!" Turning her cheek to his kiss, she laughingly disengaged from his embrace, but there was no mistaking the effect on her pulse. Over Lance's shoulder, Nancy glimpsed a look of vexation on Jane Royce's stylishly pretty face. "Don't tell me someone's meeting you," said Lance. "Never mind, if there is, the poor chump's out of luck. You're riding into town with us." Soon they were speeding along the left-hand side of the highway toward central London in a limousine long and glossy enough for the royal family. Lance had a townhouse in Chelsea and wanted Nancy to be his guest, but she insisted on taking the room Mrs. Harwood had booked for her at Claridge's Hotel in the snazzy Mayfair district of London's West End. "All right, my pet, but you're lunching with me, and let's have no back chat." "But Lance, darling, you have all sorts of press interviews set up for this afternoon," wailed Jane Royce. "And I've laid on a business meeting with the record company about your next video. So plead jet lag and reschedule." Turning to the American girl, he went on, 1 o'clock sharp, right then, love?" Nancy smiled as the Claridge's doorman held open the door of the limousine for her. "Well, okay, since you're twisting my arm." At the reception desk, a frock-coated hotel clerk informed Nancy that she'd had a phone call less than half an hour ago from Lady Lisa Penvillin. "This is her number, Miss Drew. She asked if you'd ring her up as soon as you arrived." "Thank you." Lisa was ecstatic. "Oh, Nancy, how good it is to hear your voice." "And yours, Lisa. I can't tell you how much I look forward to talking over old times. I've been counting the hours ever since Mom told me you were coming. How soon can you start for Cornwall?" Nancy had been prepared to leave London that afternoon after a brief rest and change of clothes, but her unexpected lunch date and a chance to see more of Lance Warwick had suddenly scrambled her plans. "Well, how about tomorrow, Lisa?" "Oh, good. I'll count on that, Nan. Let me just tell you how to get here. Penvillin Castle's located just outside of a little fishing village called Polpenny on the south coast of Cornwall. You can get an express train out of Paddington Station that'll—" "Whoa, let me get a pencil," laughed Nancy. After she hung up, she showered and changed into a smart green and white striped silk dress, to which she added a straw hat. When Lance phoned from the lobby, she was ready. He was hiding behind dark glasses, but they still had to make a run for it from the hotel to evade a sudden deluge of screeching rock fans. Nancy couldn't help feeling elated as they zoomed off in his sleek, open red sports car, which a bellhop had been holding ready with its engine running. She was also touched and pleased when Lance insisted on giving her a quick guided tour through the heart of London before lunch. What a feast it all is, thought Nancy. The bustling pageant of Piccadilly Circus and Trafalgar Square with its columns and lions, a glimpse of the scarlet-plumed horse guards at Whitehall, and then up Fleet Street, with the dome of St. Paul's floating on the skyline toward the fabled Tower of London and Tower Bridge. Lance circled back north past the British Museum. Then he turned south again through Soho toward the Thames to take in the House of Parliament as Big Ben was striking the quarter hour, and historic Westminster Abbey, followed by the climactic spectacle of Buckingham Palace, with a brace of bare-skinned, red-coated grenadier guards on sentry duty. Nancy had seen it all before, but she loved seeing it again. The gray, stately old city with its lovely green parks was changing. There were more modern towers and office blocks amid the ancient landmarks than Nancy had noticed on her last trip. And the clothing styles were certainly changing too. The streets teemed with young people in the wildest imaginable outfits. Bizarre haircuts and hairdos, everyone seemed bent on achieving the most outrageous possible image. "They make me feel positively stodgy," Nancy smiled. Lance beamed at her admiringly. "Ah, but there's one important difference you're forgetting." "What's that?" "None of those dolly birds is as lovely as you." Crossing Sloane Square, they drove west down King's Road through trendy Chelsea. Lance sped on past the urban sprawl to a quiet pub with garden tables overlooking the river. As they lunched on salad, prawns, and quiche, Nancy found herself forgetting that she was the guest of a famous rock star. Aside from his accent, she might have been chatting with a young American she'd known from high school. But his background was certainly worlds different from Ned Nickerson's. Working class by birth, Lance Warwick had made it to Oxford on brains alone. Originally, he'd planned to be a serious composer. Well, what made you turn to rock? She inquired. Lance grinned sharply. Ambition. I reckoned that was the fastest way to open doors and make myself rich and famous. As he spoke, his voice lost some of its Oxford accent and reverted to that of a Midland factory town. It also took on a slight edge. I'm not sure I believe that, Nancy said quietly. You'd better, love. It's the truth. Beethoven was a rare old hand at cranking out symphonies, but he'd have a rough time getting one played today, especially if he came from Leeds or Birmingham. Symphonies aren't the only kind of music worth hearing. I'll admit I'm no expert, but I've been listening to your group ever since you first began making records. You started out as a mix of punk and heavy metal, and then got more and more new wave and progressive, but right now there isn't any label that fits. Your music is different from anything else on the rock scene today. What makes you so sure that the London Symphony or New York Philharmonic won't be playing it someday? Lance Warwick looked into her eyes for a long moment. Then he murmured, You're quite an interesting woman, aren't you, Nancy Drew? A feminine figure was crossing the garden. The spell that had woven itself around her and Lance was suddenly broken as Nancy recognized Jane Royce. I do hate to interrupt this cozy little twosome, the English girl said, but I'm afraid we have an urgent problem with Ian Purcell, Lance. Ian? The rock star frowned at her irritably. He's still sunning himself in Polpenny, isn't he? Not anymore. He's back in London and acting very oddly, it appears. What's that supposed to mean? Jane Royce shrugged a shapely shoulder. Dunno, darling, I couldn't quite make it all out over the phone, but his landlady's threatening to call the police unless you come round straight away. Lance flung down his napkin angrily. What a bore! To Nancy he added, Could you possibly forgive me if I... She smiled. Don't apologize, I understand. Ian Purcell used to be your bass player, didn't he? That's right, till he got on drugs. And he's just back from Polpenny in Cornwall? Lance nodded, intrigued by her question. If I may, said Nancy, I'll come with you. End of chapter 7. Pardon me while I answer this. Okay, let's see. Let me catch up. British punk rock and drugs. Nancy sounds like a swell gal. Hey, Oscar. Kind of excited I made it to one of your read streams. Oh, that's so sweet of you. I'm glad you enjoy them. I'm really glad you got back to doing Nancy Drew books. That's why I started watching your streams on YouTube. Oh, thank you, Hades. I laugh every time I hear the name Bobo. Me too. I found V with book streams, but it was a series of unfortunate events. I'm no expert, but here's my expert opinion. Exactly. Thank you for the claps. Fashion facts. Chelsea boots get their name from King's Road, which is in Chelsea, London, and grew in popularity in the 1950s. Oh, man. Hi, Anna. Thank you for the claps. I believe that Oscar knows all the fashion facts. Good to see you. Tara and Anna and Steph and Oscar and Celeste and Hades and everyone else who's here. Hang on one sec. Okay. All the fashion facts. Oh, I'm glad you've been listening to Sears Unfortunate Events too. I hope you're enjoying it. Oscar just so fashionable. Well, obviously, he's way better at Drawful too than I am. He's probably great at it because he's got all those art skills. Okay. Let us move along. Chapter 8. An Unexpected Visitor. "What, may one ask, is so important about Polpenny?" asked Jane Royce as they drove back into London. Her taxi to the pub had been dismissed, and she was crammed none too happily into the tiny back seat of Lance's red sports car. "I've been invited to visit there," said Nancy. She told how her friend had married Lord Penvellyn. "I'm not sure I get the connection, darling. I mean, what does the fact that Ian's been loafing around Polpenny while he gets his head together have to do with your friend in Penvellyn Castle?" Nancy chose to shrug lightly. If he knows Polpenny, perhaps he can tell me what it's like." "From the way his landlady sounded, I doubt if Ian's in any state to tell anybody anything." Nancy made no reply. The notion that Ian Purcell's strange behavior might be related to Lisa Penvellyn's mysterious trouble seemed far-fetched, but nevertheless the double connection with Polpenny seemed an odd coincidence, and Nancy was determined to find out more. Purcell, it turned out, had rooms in a part of the city called Holland Park, which he used on trips back to London while recovering from his drug addiction in Cornwall. His lodging house, not far off Kensington High Street, was a once imposing stucco villa with a pillared porch that lent it a touch of faded grandeur. Now, grimy with age, it looked like a dignified old woman who had sunk into genteel poverty. "Oh, Mr. Warwick," the landlady clucked. "I've been trying to reach you ever since I heard on the telly that you were back. A girl at one of the record studios finally told me where to call after I explained it was about Mr. Purcell." "What exactly is wrong with him, Mrs. Roby?" "Oh dear, it'll break your heart when you see him, Mr. Warwick. He's hardly moved or said a word since he got in early yesterday, and when he does talk it's just gibberish. A gentleman who came to see him this morning couldn't get any sense out of him either." "Sounds like he's coming down from a bad drug trip," Lance muttered to Jane as they followed the landlady up the stairs. "Oh no, he's been staying off drugs, that I do believe," put in Mrs. Roby. "If he hadn't, you can be sure I'd have sent him packing." She knocked on the door of her lodger's room. When there was no response, Lance opened it, only to stop short with a stifled exclamation. Ian Purcell, Nancy now saw, occupied a dingy but spacious one-room apartment furnished in florid Victorian style. He was seated in front of the fireplace, partially facing the door. The skinny, straw-haired bass player showed only the barest awareness of his visitors. His eyes seemed haunted, and his mouth hung open with a trace of drool from one corner. "For God's sake, Ian, snap out of it!" Lance blurted, but the rocker's sole response when shaken was a babble of meaningless sounds. "How long has he been like this, Mrs. Roby?" "A good day and a half it's been. 'Twasn't 6 a.m. when he got in yesterday. Cook was in the kitchen when she heard him at the door. He had a key, of course, but couldn't fit it in the lock, so he rang the bell. When she let him in, he collapsed in her arms. She had to wake up our handyman, and the two of them got him upstairs to his room. Since then, I've heard him stumbling about a bit now and then, but that's all." Lance Warwick heaved a heavy sigh. "All right, I suppose we'd better call an ambulance." Nancy spoke diffidently to the landlady. "Did you say Mr. Purcell had a visitor this morning?" "That's right, miss. Quite a nice-dressed gentleman he was." "Did he give his name?" Seems he did, but I don't recall offhand. Some kind of art dealer, I believe? Oh, wait now, he left a card, come to think of it." While Lance went to a phone for an ambulance, Mrs. Roby fetched the card to show Nancy. It named the caller as Eustace Thorne, a dealer in objets... objet d'art? I don't know what this means. I'm going to type it in the chat, if anybody can tell me what it is. With the shop on Pimlico Road. Lance soon returned from the telephone. He decided that he and Jane Royce would ride along with the ambulance to inspect the sanatorium where Ian would be taken and arrange for the best possible medical care. "In the meantime, Nancy, you can drive my car back to your hotel," he said. "Jane can pick it up later. Better yet, I'll pick it up myself when I come to take you out to dinner tonight." "We're dining, are we?" Nancy smiled quizzically. "Of course we are, to make up for the way our lunch was cut short." "All right, but are you sure you want me operating that beautiful machine in London traffic? I've never driven on the left-hand side of the street before." "Nothing to it, love. I'll show you the controls myself." Before leaving, Nancy said she wanted to talk to the art dealer who had visited Ian Purcell. Lance told her how to get to Pimlico. "It's right between Buckingham Palace and Chelsea. We passed it." It was a thrill driving the lovely red sports car through London. Pimlico, Lance had informed her, was a newly fashionable shopping area. Eustace Thorne, a silk-suited man with a walrus mustache and a carnation on his lapel, was more than willing to answer Nancy's question. Lance Warwick, she learned, had phoned ahead to introduce her. "Then, may I ask why you went to see Ian Purcell, Mr. Thorne?" she began. "About the Golden Mab, my dear. You see, he told me last week that he'd recently seen a duplicate of the statuette." "The Golden Mab?" Nancy Drew frowned. "Should I know what that means?" The art dealer shrugged and fluttered his well-manicured hands. "Perhaps not if you've just arrived in London. It's been receiving a good deal of media coverage lately. The statuette is a bust of the old pagan British goddess Mab, or Mav, as the Irish called her. She's sometimes known as the goddess of the witches." Witches? Another coincidence? Nancy repressed a shiver of excitement as Eustace Thorne went on. "It's the finest example of ancient Celtic art ever discovered. It's now on display at the Tate Gallery, by courtesy of the present owner to whom I sold the bust last year." "It's quite valuable, then?" "The gold alone makes it worth a small fortune. As a historical art treasure, 10 times its weight in gold would be a modest valuation." Nancy regarded Thorne thoughtfully. "You believe Ian Purcell was telling the truth?" "Who knows, my dear? All I can tell you is that art experts have traditionally held that the Golden Mab was one of a matching pair. A layman like Purcell would be unlikely to know that, yet he told me this other Mab he'd seen faced right, whereas the bust at the Tate Gallery faces left. It gave his story a certain ring of authenticity." "Did he give you any hint about where he'd seen this other Mab?" Eustace Thorne shook his head sadly. "Alas, no. He merely left his name and address and promised to return with photographic evidence. When he failed to do so, I took it upon myself to pay him a visit. I gather you saw him with your own eyes the condition I found him in?" When Nancy arrived back at Claridge's, she decided this would be a good time to phone her father. With the 5-hour time difference between London and River Heights, he should be breaking for lunch soon. Carson Drew's delight upon hearing from his daughter was evident even over 3,000 miles of ocean. "How are things in jolly old London, honey?" "Marvelous, Daddy. I'm having such fun. I haven't even seen Lisa yet, but I've already stumbled on a brand new mystery." "Well, that's no surprise coming from my favorite sleuth. By the way, let me give you the name and number of a law firm you can go to if you run into any complications. It's Huntley and Dawlish in Lincoln's Inn. They're top-flight criminal barristers. They can advise you or put you in touch with the right man at Scotland Yard." "Oh, good." Nancy wrote down the information. Her father also reported that there was a special clause in Lisa's trust fund that provided for Mrs. Harwood to serve as executor should her daughter ever become ill or incompetent. Nancy had barely hung up when the phone rang. She felt a moment's panic. Surely this couldn't be Lance Warwick so early. She hadn't even changed or showered yet. Instead, a hotel clerk's voice informed her that a Miss Jane Royce was in the lobby. "Oh, yes, of course. Ask her to come up, please." The young Englishwoman wore a cool smile when Nancy opened the door to her knock. "Surprised to see me?" "Not at all. Do come in. I'm sorry I have no refreshments to offer you, but let me call—" No. I can't stay long, darling, so let me get right to the point." Jane Royce took a chair and helped herself to a cigarette before speaking. "You're rather fond of Lance, aren't you?" "Well, he's certainly been very nice to me," Nancy replied, "and I'm sure any girl would call him attractive. Yes, I like him." Her visitor's smile became a trifle patronizing. "I thought so. Well, Nancy, dear, may I offer a word of advice?" "Of course. Don't get too fond of him." "Why not?" "We haven't broken the news yet, even to the rest of the group, but you see, Lance and I plan to marry soon." It's the end of chapter 8. Okay. Let's make her shop. Like, Nancy hasn't even gotten to Penvillin, like the Penvillin house, and we're almost halfway through the book. I'm stuck in a group text of people Animal Crossing-ing, and I'm like, I'm busy! Fashionable, I'll take it. You so fashionable! Oscar designing layouts and designing point-winning answers. Agreed. Penvillin Castle. Hi, Random. How's it going? Oh, and hello, Tara, of course. Thank you for shouting out. Oscar and Anna. Objet? Is it objet d'art? Art objects or works of art. Objet? Objet d'art. But you just streamed the other day. It's true. Interesting into the chapter. Yeah, I know. Yeah, you heard Montana. Thank you for the claps. That was chapter 8. Yeah, that was chapter 8. I think. Yeah, that was chapter 8. Nancy needs black leather jacket, red plaid pants, combat boots with silver spikes, and a mohawk. Whatever numbers, Montana here. Yeah. So yeah, so far my thoughts of this book are, where's the actual pen villain mystery? Because right now Nancy's just like dating 2 boys at once. Oh gosh. Okay. We shall keep going. Is the music okay? Is it too loud? Okay. Moving along. Chapter 9, A Night on the Town. Though taken aback and hurt by the news, Nancy forced a smile and murmured, "Congratulations." "One congratulates the man, dear," Jane Royce responded, "and wishes the bride-to-be happiness." "You're right, of course, Jane. I spoke without thinking, and I do wish you every happiness." "How sweet! You're not offended, I hope, at my saying all this?" "Not at all." Nancy found it hard to go on smiling, but did her best to inject some warmth into her voice. "I appreciate your frankness. In your place, I would have done the same thing." "Good. Then I needn't take up any more of your time." The taffy blonde Londoner rose with feline grace and stubbed out her cigarette in a hotel ashtray. "Lads will still come round to take you out to dine, with my blessings," she added silkily. "So enjoy yourself, darling." She was gone before the American girl could fully collect herself and recover her emotional poise. Alone once again, Nancy bit her lip to keep it from quivering, but she could feel tears welling in her eyes. How could Lance have been so insensitive, leading her on and watching her respond to his flirtatious advances, while all the while his fiancé looked on, pitying her naivety? Boyfriend. She felt like flinging herself on the bed and sobbing. But Nancy had never been one to indulge in self-pity. Instead, she concentrated on filing her nails until her feelings calmed down. Then she dashed off a letter to Hannah Gruen and prepared to shower. By the time Lance arrived, she had changed into a sapphire blue dress which reflected her sapphire eyes and set off her red gold hair perfectly. Around her neck was a small string of pearls which, with matching earrings, had been her 18th birthday present from Carson Drew. The result was obvious from Lance's expression. "Did anyone ever tell you that you're beautiful?" he said huskily, offering his arm. Nancy dimpled. "Well, let's see now. Yes, I seem to recall hearing that line a few times from my boyfriend back in the States." "He must be some kind of dork then, if it's just a line. You're flat out gorgeous, love." They dined at Susabelle's in Curzon Street. The decor was campily 1950s with posters and newspaper blow-ups on the walls from that era. The atmosphere was one of balloons and confetti, and Rock King Lance Warwick was plainly a favorite patron. They were showered with attention, and their table was beset by eager fans until the maitre d' took up the microphone and forbade further autograph hunting. Nancy found her spirits lifting. Over dessert and coffee, Lance said, "This Yank boyfriend you were telling me about, is it serious?" "Well, we haven't decided yet." "Then it's not." Nancy smiled. "I didn't say that. Ned and I have been going together so long, we found ourselves taking each other for granted, so we decided to date other people until we make up our minds." "Wise child. I'll drink to that." "What about yourself?" said Nancy. "I understand congratulations are in order for you and Jane." Lance set down his cup. "Now what scheming little birdie told you that tiresome twaddle? Dear little Janie Royce, no doubt." Nancy shrugged evasively. "Does that matter?" "Yes, it ruddy well does. Let me tell you something, my sweet. Janie's been at me since the year 1 to go tripping down the aisle with her, and I just keep telling her to belt up. I wouldn't take that kind of nonsense from any other bird. The thing is, she's good at her job, too good to sack. Lance paused with a look of embarrassment and twiddled the stem of his glass reflectively. Oh, we've had our tender moments, Jane and I, if you must know, but that's all they were. Just the odd kiss and hug at times when we've both been under pressure or just launched a new record successfully. What matters is that Jane's the best in the business when it comes to publicity. Got a sixth sense for what'll make the headlines, that girl. She knows how to squeeze every drop of favorable press coverage out of any angle that comes along. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Nancy's eyes glowed back at him. She was suddenly feeling much happier. Yes, I think so. Good, then let's just get on with the evening. The evening was indeed just beginning. From the restaurant they drove to the Camden Palace in North London. Best club in Europe, Lance confided to her at the door. The music level inside blasted her ears, and the costumes of the patrons were the most bizarre that Nancy had seen yet. Afterward, they went to two of London's avant-garde nomadic clubs, which Lance told her did not even advertise, and had no fixed address. Très exclusive, he chuckled. One only gets to know where they are by word of mouth. Nancy could believe it. One of the clubs consisted of a tent set up for the night in an empty shell of an abandoned building. As they danced, Lance whispered in her ear, "You're quite a girl, Nancy Drew. When we first met, even this morning at the airport, I thought you were just an exceptionally lovely bit of crumpet. But you're much more than that, you know. You're something quite special." Their lips met tenderly, despite the loud blare of rock music. "Must you go to Cornwall tomorrow?" Lance asked softly before depositing her at Claridge's later that night. "I'm afraid I must. I promised my friend, which reminds me, how is Ian Purcell?" "Still tripping, if that's an explanation." "How odd," Nancy mused with a puzzled frown. "I wish I knew the explanation." "Look here," said Lance. "If you'll stay on for tomorrow morning, I'll take you to see him, and you can speak to the doctor yourself. I must admit I'm curious enough to accept your offer, but I'd also like to pay a quick visit to the Tate Gallery." "Say no more, then. It's a date, then, darling." Next morning, after breakfast at the hotel, they drove to Hampstead, a charming village-like spot in North London. The clinic to which Ian had been taken was a half-timbered Elizabethan country house overlooking the wild green heath. Dr. Palmer, the white-coated psychiatrist in charge, patiently answered Nancy's questions, but admitted he found the case baffling. Could his condition simply be due to an overdose? Nancy inquired. Dr. Palmer shook his head. Most unlikely. In fact, he shows certain physical withdrawal symptoms that indicate he was quitting drugs cold turkey. Emotionally, he behaves as though he's undergone a terrifying shock, some experience which literally scared him out of his wits. The medic frowned and hesitated. "And there's one other odd circumstance." "What's that, doctor?" Nancy asked. "Mr. Purcell has a needle puncture mark in the back of one leg. Not at all a place where I should think it could have been self-inflicted." "Does that suggest anything?" Dr. Palmer shrugged uncomfortably. "Perhaps that he was deliberately injected with some mind-scrambling drug that has left him in his present disoriented state. I'm afraid one can only hope that time and rest will restore his full faculties." Nancy was thoughtful on the ride back into central London. "How did Ian happen to go to Polpenny after he left your group, Lance?" "Search me. He and Bobo Evans were mates, and they seemed to fancy the place. They'd often go there to unwind between gigs." The imposing neoclassical Tate Gallery on an embankment of the Thames was their next stop. Nancy was eager to see again the fantastic drawings of William Blake and the glowing watercolors of Joseph Turner. But her favorite of favorites was a wall of Victorian fairy paintings, especially one called the Fairy Feller's Masterstroke by a mad English artist, Richard Dadd, who died without explaining his strange masterpiece. "Blimey, what do you make of that?" said Lance. "In a word, I think it's wonderful." Nancy's main interest that day, however, was the Golden Mab. The bust was displayed amid a variety of modern and abstract sculpture. A placard said that it represented an ancient Celtic fertility goddess and had originally been dug up in the Somerset marshes during the reign of Henry VIII. The lovely gold statuette portrayed a woman gazing at herself in a mirror. "Vain old bird, eh?" murmured Lance. "With much to be vain about," replied Nancy. As the art dealer had said, this Mab held the mirror in her left hand and looked to the left. There was no time for lunch if Nancy hoped to arrive in Polpenny at a convenient hour, but Lance took her to watch the colorful changing of the guard before driving on to Paddington Station. "By the way," Lance said with a grin at the last moment through the window of the train, "I've a surprise announcement to make." "Well, you better make it fast." A voice was already booming over the PA system that her train was about to depart. "I'll be seeing you in Cornwall, love." Nancy's heart danced. In a word, wonderful! She leaned out of the window and blew him a kiss as her train pulled out of the station. End of chapter 9. What is this book? Let me scroll up. Okay. Now we got Bobo and the Middle-Aged Rockers. 2 boyfriends. Is that the 1980s in London? That's true. I want a sapphire dress and ruby slippers. Accessories. A little dog, too. Beware flying monkeys. That's when you borrow Scarecrow's gun for flying monkeys. Ah, dang bot. Thank you for blocking the bot. I really need to rewatch that. You and your Nancy Drew love stories. This is ridiculous. If I had to guess your name, age, and job, you are Lucy, 23, and a bartender. Wrong, wrong, and wrong. There's some pro eye and head rolls going on today. This is the worst. This is supposedly Kerr, yeah. Can't you tell I rock circus? I'm not really comfortable with that first question, Ace Platinum. I don't know if you are trying to be funny or not, but I don't appreciate questions like that. My favorite fast food is Chick-fil-A, and my favorite soda is Cheerwine. Also, please do not be rude to my mods. I appreciate Heartless Shroom answering the question while I was reading, and if you can't be kind about that, then I would request you to be kind. Yeah, I don't feel comfortable answering the question about shoes. That seems like it, honest. To be frank, it's not really any of your business. No, my name is not Lucy, I'm not 23, and I'm not a bartender. Also, I'm performing a British accent for some of these characters in this book, but I'm not actually British. Oh yeah, I definitely am from Jersey. Okay. Let me just respond. Rick Allen. Oh, Rick. Yeah, this book sucks so far. They made a great game out of a cruddy book. Okay, here we go. Lord. Chapter 10. A Haunted Land. The train ride to Penzance, which was the nearest station to Polpenny, lasted almost 5 hours, but Nancy enjoyed it thoroughly. She thought she'd never seen a countryside so richly green, and it was somehow comforting to look at. The train out of London had been crowded with travelers. On the last leg of the journey, however, Nancy found herself alone in the compartment with a tweedy, red-faced old gentleman with a bristly white military mustache and a smelly pipe. But she soon forgave him the pipe as a fair exchange for his interesting conversation. Ever been to Cornwall before, young lady? He inquired with a bluff, soldierly directness. No, are we close? Nancy replied. That river we just crossed was the Tamar. To a Cornishman, everyone from the other side of the Tamar, English or not, is a foreigner. They sound rather clannish. The elderly gentleman chuckled. One could say that. And the attitude's not at all one-sided, come to that. There was a time when tots in Devon were told that Cornishmen had tails. Nancy laughed appreciatively. I'm Colonel Tremaine, by the way. Retired. I'm Nancy Drew. American, I take it, from your charming accent. Yes, though opinions differ on our accent, I imagine. And are you Cornish by chance? You guessed from my name, no doubt. No, should I have? You've not heard the old jingle, then. By land, Ross, car, pole, tray, and pen. Yea, they may know the Cornishmen. Tray for Tremaine. Nancy smiled with pleasure. I find that rather charming, Colonel. Thank you for telling me. But why do Cornishmen feel so different? Is it just because they live in the farthest west corner of Britain on their own separate peninsula? Partly that, I dare say, but people also forget that jolly old England's actually a mixture of two hostile races. What do you mean? Celts and Anglo-Saxons. The movies, you know, would have us believe that King Arthur and his knights spoke Oxford English, which is nonsense, of course. They were Romanized Celts who spoke Old Welsh or Cornish when they weren't talking Latin. The nearest thing to English speakers in those days were their enemies, the Saxon barbarians from across the Channel. In the end, the two sides got together, but not before the Celts had been overrun and nearly pushed off their own island. Nancy stared dreamily out the coach window. How I loved those old stories of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. So did we all, my dear. Some say they're sleeping under a hill ready to come out and fight again if Britain's ever invaded. Nancy shivered. What a thrilling superstition. Perhaps not everyone in those parts would call it a superstition. Are you serious? Colonel Tremaine shrugged and refilled his pipe gravely. Let's just say it's a haunted land you've come to, Miss Drew, full of myths and legends. Nancy was silent a while, thinking of elf darts and witches and the twin golden mab. Is Cornwall really so ancient? She asked presently. Oldest corner of Britain, my dear. There were Stone Age miners digging tin and copper hereabouts long before Athens and Rome were even built. Phoenician traders came here and carried the ore to the Mediterranean. Some say that's why you'll still see a good many dark-haired, hook-nosed Cornishmen. Nancy glimpsed rocky headlands and blue sea and picturesque fishing villages. At one point she did a startled double take. Were those palm trees I just saw? Her companion smiled. You're on the Cornish Riviera now, my dear. Warming influence of the Gulf Stream. It's another reason tourists flock here, not to mention artists and writers and other such layabouts. By the time she descended from the train at Penzance, Nancy was eager to see more of Cornwall. Lisa was waiting to greet her, and the two girls fell into each other's arms. Oh, Nancy, you're just looking beautiful. So are you, Lisa. But Nancy secretly crossed her fingers, unhappy about having to fib. No, I'm not. You needn't worry about hurting my feelings, Nancy. I see myself in the mirror every morning. To tell the truth, I haven't been feeling well these last few months, but now that you're here, I'm sure I'll perk up. I hope so, Lisa, dear. In the station parking lot, they came to a huge, lemon-colored British roadster of 1920s or 1930s vintage, with a hood that looked about a mile long to Nancy. Good night, is this your royal carriage? Lisa giggled. It belonged to Hugh's uncle, the old Lord Penvillin from whom he inherited the castle. Uncle Nick was quite a lively old dog. I'm told he bought this dinosaur in his youth before the Battle of Britain, and loved it so much he kept it in tip-top shape. Hugh considers it the best part of his inheritance. Lisa had the porter load Nancy's luggage into the car, and moments later the two girls drove off. Nancy was thrilled as they whizzed along smoothly. Your husband's right, Lisa. This car is a gem. I wish Ned could see it. Speaking of whom, how are things between you two, Nancy? We've decided to date other people for a while. Ah, so things are at that stage, are they? Do I gather you've already met someone new and interesting, or even fascinating? Well, Nancy smiled somewhat noncommittally. Interesting, yes. And I guess most girls would call him fascinating too, but I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about him just yet. Lisa threw her an understanding smile. All right, we'll save all that for a cozy chat later. What about yourself? You and Hugh, I mean. Are you enjoying the state of holy matrimony? Nancy was shocked at the shadow that seemed to fall across her friend's face. I love Hugh more than ever, Nancy. Lisa replied in a voice that sounded slightly unsteady. But I'll admit, things have not been perfect since we settled in at Penvillin Castle. Can I help? Nancy asked after a pause. Lisa looked at her. That's why you're here, isn't it? Yes. Nancy flushed, but decided the truth was preferable to deceit. That's not the only reason I've come, though. I did want to see you, but your mother was very worried, and, well, all of that seemed a good enough reason. I thought so, and I'm glad you've come, Nancy, but I'm not sure what you or anyone can do. Is there anything you'd like to tell me? Her friend shrugged unhappily. It's all so vague and depressing. I hardly know how to answer that, Nancy. Hardly anyone in Polpenny will even speak to me. It's as if they resent my coming to Penvillin Castle, and Hugh seems terribly glum and weighed down, as though he's carrying some dreadful secret, and I've been feeling rotten, and, oh dear, nothing seems to have gone right for us. Lisa's voice quavered, and her eyes glistened. Nancy patted her head. All right, you can tell me, patted her hand. All right, you can tell me all about it when we have that cozy chat. Penzance seemed a colorful, bustling summer resort, but once they were outside the town on the road to Polpenny, the landscape became rugged and stark, and Nancy began to glean a sense of Cornwall as a remote peninsula jutting out into the wild Atlantic. I should probably be giving you the standard tourist lecture, said Lisa. Never mind, Nancy chuckled. I've already had one from an old gentleman on the train. Polpenny actually lay beyond Penvillin Castle, so Nancy had little chance to take it in before she was overwhelmed by the spectacle of the castle itself. The ancient mossy stone pile stood on a rugged headland overlooking the sea, just as she had seen it in the photo, with the fishing village a mere cluster of roofs around the harbor at the foot of the grassy slopes of the cove. Well, Lisa smiled as they parked in the courtyard and got out of the car. How do you like it? Nancy stared up at the gray walls wide-eyed. I'm breathless. We only live in one wing. Oh, here comes Hugh. Nancy had met the present Lord Penvillin at the time of his wedding to Lisa, soon after he inherited the title. Black-haired and in his late 20s, he was a tall, powerfully built young man with a strong jaw and thick dark brows that met almost over a fierce hawk nose. He had been a foreign correspondent, but since his marriage, he'd been writing a book on international policies. Nancy thought that, like Lisa, he looked drawn and tired. His mood seemed almost sober, though he smiled cordially as he took her hand. I'm so glad you've come, Nancy. I know how much Lisa's been looking forward to your visit. I'm sure it'll be fun for both of us, Hugh. Nancy had time to rest and change for dinner, which was served in a high-ceilinged, paneled room on a large refectory table. The long summer twilight had faded when they finally moved into the drawing room for coffee. Hugh was telling Nancy about the progress of his book. It's coming rather slowly, I'm afraid. The whole situation's changing so fast that... He broke off as a scream suddenly rent the air from the courtyard outside. Okay. Let me catch up. This is the end of chapter 10. I'm reading 2 more. Jersey Girls are very interesting. Thank you for the follow, Ace. Oh. I didn't know I had an accent. I feel like I have a pretty neutral voice, but I suppose everybody has some sort of accent. I grew up in New Jersey, but I'm nothing like the TV shows. To answer your, or to comment on your comment about the Nancy Drew thing, there are multiple Nancy Drew movies and multiple Nancy Drew books. There's about 300 Nancy Drew books. However, the ones I've been reading on stream are the books that the games are based off of. There are 33 main series Nancy Drew computer games and a few spin-offs, and all of them are based on a Nancy Drew book of some sort. This is the book that the 11th game is based off of, and I'm just doing that as like a fun way to sort of compare the book versus the game, since I started out streaming the games. So I'm kind of just going back and reading the books that those games are based off of. Jake decided he wanted to come inside from sitting on his chair outside. Aw, puppies. By the way, I'm applying for a summer job at the library, which would include reading to children. Since your reading streams are really good, I wondered if you had any tips for reading aloud. Oh, yes. So some tips that I'd have would be, don't feel like you have to go too fast. The slower you read, the more accurate you are. And you'll get more comfortable the more you do it. So, obviously, I would say start with books that are easier to read, quicker to read, or books that you're very familiar with. Obviously, children's books are easier to read than, like, trying to get, like, a old, you know, a huge, thick novel. Like, it'd be easier for you to read something like Nancy Drew than it would for you to read, like, Little Women or something. So I would say start with smaller books, you know, that are a little bit easier to grasp. But yeah, don't feel like you have to rush. I feel like, at least for myself, I tend to trip over my tongue more the faster I try to go. And naturally, I try to go faster in parts of the book that are maybe tense or, like, emotionally driven. But it's okay to, like, take it slow. And then it's always nice, even if you don't give all your characters different voices, but just to, like, inflect your voice as if you're reading the words, almost like they're, like, lines for a theater show or like a play. Don't read it like it's a monotone conversation if you're reading dialogue between characters. But other than that, it's just kind of like, as long as you find books that you enjoy, you just read them aloud and let your fun kind of shine through. So those are the tips that I would have. There was a TV show in the 40s, I believe. The first Nancy Drew book came out in 1930. There was a series in the 30s, or the 40s. I think there was a series in the 70s. There's a series on the CW right now. There's been movies throughout the whole time. You know, all of that kind of stuff. Petting her hand to petting her head. I think she should pet Montana. Okay, Montana, you get a pet. Oh, yeah. She liked the pets. Yeah, it's hard to determine when a teen detective starts when she's been a teen detective forever. Teenager years are hard. Near a century of being a teenager, she's maybe a vampire. There's a Nancy Drew story. What do you do for yourself? What do you mean? Oh, I'm a front desk manager at a hotel, and I'm 27. Reading Little Women to children. That's a good nap time book. Nancy found the Fountain of Youth on one of her adventures. Yeah, that's it. I'll be reading children's books. That's good. We have theme weeks, so if it's dinosaur week, I'll read a dinosaur book. That's really fun. I like that. Montana is the doggy. Montana, we're talking about you on the internet. She's looking at me. Montana. Monty. Monty. Hey, look you. Hey. She's trying to nap. Yeah, I also have access to the Fountain of Youth. I haven't really changed in appearance since I've been about 16. Yeah. Since I was a older teen. But I'm basically an old woman. 1 foot in the grave. Basically a grandma. I also act like a grandma. So anyway. Okay. We have 2 more chapters, so let's jump into those. Chapter 11. Spook Attack. Hugh leapt to his feet. What the deuce was that? Someone's been hurt, cried Lisa. The 3 ran from the drawing room into the great hall of the castle. Landreth the butler and one of the maids came rushing into the small anteroom that lay between the great hall and the front door. What's happened, Landreth? Hugh inquired. I don't know, my lord. I'll turn on the ground lights. The whole courtyard was brightly illuminated as they stepped outside, but no one was in sight. Perhaps someone's outside the gateway, said the butler after peering around. He and Hugh hurried to check. Moments later they returned, supporting a woman between them. She looked close to 60 and was somewhat disheveled, with her broad-brimmed felt hat askew over one eye, but seemed otherwise unhurt. "Why, it's Ethel Bossany!" gasped Lisa. "A friend of yours?" Nancy asked. "Yes, one of the few I've made in Polpenny. She's a retired games mistress from a girls' school near here. She instructed the girls in sports there. A bit dotty, but she's been a great comfort to me." When Miss Bossany was seated in the drawing room and given a cup of tea, they learned that she had been bicycling up to the castle gateway when a startling figure loomed out of the darkness. "Was it anyone you recognized?" Hugh asked. I couldn't really say." Ethel Bossany gave a hoarse, embarrassed laugh. "Perhaps it was all my imagination. Anyhow, my bicycle went off the path and turned over, and I lay there stunned until you and Landreth came and helped me up." She said she'd been coming to pay a neighborly call on the Penvillans, and the village postmistress had asked her to deliver a letter to their young American visitor. Unfortunately, she had dropped it when her bike overturned. Landreth retrieved the bicycle, but neither he nor the maid could find the letter. Miss Bossany was much distressed. "Oh my, I'm dreadfully sorry, Miss Drew. I don't know how I could have been so careless." "Never mind," Nancy smiled. "I'm sure it'll turn up. It was good of you to bring it." The next morning, Lisa showed Nancy around the castle. The original stronghold was built by the Normans back in the 12th century, she explained. Most of it has crumbled away, but the central keep has been preserved. Beginning in the 1500s, wings were added, connecting the keep to other buildings inside the bailey, or outer wall. We're living in the newest wing, which I'm told was built in 1650 or thereabouts. Nancy chuckled. 1650 is close enough for me. I must say it's withstood the centuries very well. We've added a few modern conveniences, of course, like central heating and plumbing. Nancy was glad to hear her friend laugh. Her visit already seemed to have cheered Lisa up. The older, unoccupied parts of the castle were now open to public tours. Much of the woodwork in those areas had long ago rotted away, and most of the furnishings, too, had been decayed or been removed, leaving little behind but drafty, echoing stone ruins. But as the two friends strolled back to the central keep, Nancy was surprised to see one room shut off by a stout, iron-bound oak door. "What's in here?" she asked curiously. "I don't know." "Aren't you curious?" Lisa hesitated. Her cheeks seemed to have lost color again. "Hugh keeps that room shut up. I'm not sure why, but he seems to feel quite strongly about it, so I respect his wishes." Nancy couldn't help remembering the old fairy tale about Bluebeard, who forbade his beautiful young wife ever to open a certain room in his castle. When she did and discovered its sinister secret, the heads of former wives he'd murdered, she almost became another of his victims. Seeing her friend's unhappy face, however, Nancy kept that thought to herself. When the girls returned to the great hall of the castle, Lisa was ready for elevensies, the British version of a morning snack. Nancy was eager to see the village, but she couldn't persuade Lisa to accompany her. "You'll enjoy it more by yourself, Nancy." "Why do you say that?" "I've told you, most of the villagers will hardly speak to me. I think they're more apt to be friendly to you if they don't see us together." Nancy set off downhill, preferring to stretch her legs rather than borrow Lisa's bike. Polpenny was little more than a cluster of stone cottages, most of them whitewashed and thatch-roofed, circling the cove. All activity seemed to center on the cobbled high street around the harbor, but even that seemed none too busy. There were only 2 or 3 wooden docks. Most of the boats were simply drawn up on the stony shingle which sloped down into the water. Coming to the small town hall, she decided to introduce herself to the local constable. "My name's Nancy Drew." The young policeman nodded and smiled politely. "Yes, ma'am, I know. I'm Constable Kenyon." Nancy was surprised, but went on diffidently. "Then maybe you also know I'm an amateur detective?" "Yes, miss, I've read about some of your cases." "Would you mind if I asked you some questions?" "Of course not. Please have a chair." "Thank you." Nancy sat down. "There's a rock musician, Ian Purcell, who stayed in Polpenny while he was getting over his drug habit." Constable Kenyon nodded again, somewhat tight-lipped. "Yes, ma'am, I know him." "Have you any idea how recently he was here?" "In Polpenny? Can't say for sure, ma'am. He just camps out, like some of the tourists do, and he often goes back and forth to London." Nancy explained what had happened to Ian Purcell and asked, "Could he have been here just before he turned up at his rooming house in London?" The policeman frowned thoughtfully. "Hard to say, ma'am. All I can tell you is I haven't seen him around this past week." "What about drugs?" Nancy asked. "Are they much of a problem here locally? Does any dealing go on?" Kenyon shrugged. "It's the tourists who give us headaches more than the locals. There was a pusher arrested in Penzance the other day. That's the only recent case. Mind you, there are rumors that dealing goes on at the old 10-mine engine house. Where is that? West of the headland, out near the edge of the moor. You can see the smokestack from the castle. The mine's closed, you see, so the engine house area is all deserted. I've staked it out once or twice at night, but I never caught anyone. Nancy pondered a bit before asking, "One last question, Constable. This may sound silly, but have you ever heard talk of a local witch cult?" Just for a moment, she thought Kenyon's glance flickered. Then his jaw clamped grimly. "There's always gossip of that sort, I reckon, especially here in Cornwall, but there's no such going-ons in Polpenny that I know of." Nancy thanked him, rose, and walked out thoughtfully into the summer sunshine. She was puzzled by the fact that he had known of her sleuthing. How had he found out? From a castle servant? She wandered about, gazing in shop windows and exploring the byways. The villagers smiled at her, and their lilting accents were pleasant to hear, but everyone seemed to know that she was Lady Penvillen's American friend, and her attempts at conversation were politely rebuffed. Nancy felt frustrated and annoyed. What on earth could they have against Lisa, and why should such resentment brush off on her? Finally, she turned back toward the harbor. The breeze carried a refreshing tang of salt air. A young man in a tweed sports jacket was chatting with fishermen as they mended their nets. Seeing Nancy, he broke off and came walking toward her. "Excuse me, you're Nancy Drew, aren't you?" "Why, yes," Nancy smiled, pleased that someone had finally spoken to her. "How did you know?" "It's my business to know, you might say. I'm Alan Trevor, a reporter for the Western Sun. Nancy recognized the name of one of England's larger West Country newspapers, having seen it on railway newsstands. "But surely I'm not that well known on this side of the Atlantic." "You are now." The reporter, husky and clean-shaven, had a brash, smart-alecky manner that nettled Nancy. "In the States you may be a famous girl detective, but over here you're Lance Warwick's latest bird. Warwick's scheduled a gig in Cornwall, so you've come to be near him, right? Officially, of course, you're hunting drug pushers and a gold statuette." Nancy was breathless with shock and outrage. I beg your pardon?" she stuttered angrily. Trevor grinned. "If it's the bit about Lance Warwick that upsets you, Miss Drew, don't blame me. It's all in the tabloids. All I want to know is whether you've dug up any mystery at the castle." "Why not read your trashy tabloids and find out yourself?" Nancy retorted, then turned and walked away. Angry as she was, Nancy simply had to find out if there was any truth in Alan Trevor's remarks, so she bought a couple of London papers at a village sweet shop. It took only a moment of leafing through the pages to confirm her fears. Simmering, she trudged back up the road to Penvillen Castle. Questions were rising in her mind, none of them pleasant to dwell on. Partly to distract herself, Nancy decided to look for the letter that Ethel Bosney had lost the night before. From her and the butler's remarks, Nancy knew the bicycle had overturned near a huge old oak tree and a clump of shrubbery just to the right of the path leading up to the castle gateway. To her surprise, she quickly sighted a lavender envelope. It bore the crowned head's monogram and was addressed to her at Penvillen Castle in Lance's handwriting. Nancy was eager to read the letter in private. Luckily, she managed to get up to her room without encountering Lisa or Hugh. To her annoyance, her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. But there was no letter inside. Nancy could feel something else, however, small and hard. She shook it out of the palm of her hand and caught her breath. It was a tiny glassy stone arrowhead. Another elf bolt. Surely Lance hadn't sent her this, but if not, who had? Some other member of his group? Another explanation was possible, Nancy realized. The spook might have filched the envelope after Ethel Bosney was helped indoors, and then removed the letter and inserted the elf bolt before putting the envelope back during the night. But why? As a warning to this young American busybody to leave Polpenny Castle and not pry into matters of witchcraft that didn't concern her? Despite her normal, commonsensical outlook, Nancy could not shake off a chill of fear that trickled down her spine. Slumping in her chair, she let the elf bolt and envelope fall into her lap and clasped her hands to keep them from trembling. "What I need," Nancy told herself sternly, "is to get so mad that I will not have room to be frightened." Which was easy enough once she opened those London tabloids and read the leering accounts of her friendship with Lance. One paper ran a photo of them in his sports car escaping the fans outside her hotel. The implication was clear, that the American sleuth was the latest addition to Lance Warwick's harem of groupies. Nancy was furious. What if those reports were to filter back to America and be read by her dad and Hannah and all her friends from River Heights? Nancy felt a need to work off her churning emotional energy, yet she didn't want to be seen by the servants or risk facing Lisa or Hugh in her upset state. To calm herself, she began walking down the corridor, her thoughts in turmoil. No wonder Constable Kenyon knew all about her. Those hateful news stories might even partly explain the villagers' coolness toward her. She slowed her steps as angry voices drifted toward her. Nancy realized that she was near the Penvillans' private suite. "I've told you before, what's in that room is none of your business," Hugh was saying stormily. "But why not, if I'm your wife?" Lisa pleaded. "Because I say so, and I'm your husband. What kind of a marriage do we have if you can't trust me that far? Doesn't trust work both ways? Hugh, I felt so foolish and ashamed having to admit to Nancy that you wouldn't even tell me why you keep that room shut up and locked." "Nancy's here as our guest, not as a detective," Lord Penvillan retorted. "Why I choose to keep that room closed is none of her business either." "I'm not a child. You have no right to treat me like one." Lisa's voice rose and quavered. She sounded on the verge of tears. "What can possibly be in there that is so terrible you cannot even confide in me, your wife? Just take my word, that's all. That room must remain locked to protect my family name and our happiness. Don't you understand?" Hugh's hot-tempered words turned cold and grim as he ended. "I want you and your friend to stay away from that room. Is that clear? From now on, I don't even want to hear it mentioned." End of chapter 11. I know, literally, I have 2 foots in the grave. Literally, the whole chapter started out, "What the deuce is that?" I feel like that is practically swearing. For a Nancy Drew book, that seems mega edgy. This is the edgiest Nancy Drew book maybe in existence. Ethel and her entrances. I look much younger than I am, but I'm 35, so I'm okay with that. Seriously, English people to not talk like that. I'm not scared of the ghost, I'm scared of Ethel. I think that's correct for everyone. Ethel Botox. Bossany. But I feel like I'm right. What is W and F? Whoa, that's weird. When I hover over this emote that is showing up in my chatbot, it says W and F, but when I hover over it, it says Heart L1 Loki Lul. So it should be the Loki Lul, but instead it looks really weird. It's like just 3 letters. Nancy kept that thought to herself. This book takes place in the Shire, confirmed. Yeah, that was so sad. Go read it yourself! Montana tags. Whispers. I'm always hyped to hear dog noises. I love how she didn't mention Ned. Psh, Ned finds out whatever. I'm not a child, I'm not. Exactly. Please let Ned read the paper, right? Immediately breaks down the door. Claps for chapter 11 from inside the mysterious room. Botoxany. Exactly. I have the same thing on mine, Riddy. I told Riddy that. Me and Riddy can be the same person. That's the I don't know what motions those are. Ridv, yeah, exactly. One more chapter and then we're done for today. I don't know if I'm gonna come back later with Pokemon. It depends on if I get everything else done. I forgot that I told myself I really need to do my taxes today, so I need to do that. So I don't know if I'm going to come back later to do Pokemon or not. I also want to play some more Animal Crossing and play some with my mom, so we'll see. But at least for right now, one more chapter of this book. This book. Yeah, totally. That's what's happening. Terror. Chapter 12. Danger in the Dark. Nancy's cheeks burned with embarrassment. It was bad enough to feel like a snoop whose prying had caused trouble between a couple she was so fond of. But to learn of this by eavesdropping, even unintentionally, seemed to make it all the worse. The teenager turned and fled down the corridor, fearful that the Penvillans' door might open at any moment. Back in her own room, Nancy brooded over the mystery. Was the dispute she had just overheard bitter enough and important enough to have caused Lisa's unhappiness and loss of health? Surely her friend's trouble went deeper than mere resentment over her husband's secrecy, but if so, what was the real cause? Neither Lisa nor Hugh appeared at lunch, so Nancy was left to pick at her salad and cutlet alone. She had just finished her tea and risen from the table when the butler announced Ethel Bossany.
"I've explained that her ladyship is not feeling well and that Lord Penvillin is busy in the library working on his book," Landreth told Nancy. "Do you wish to see her, miss?"
"Yes, sure. Please show her in." Miss Bossany's manner by daylight was bluff and hearty. Nancy could well imagine that she might prove slightly overwhelming as a constant companion. "What's wrong with Lisa, my dear?" she demanded. "Another one of those deuced headaches." "I'm afraid so," Nancy said. "She didn't feel well enough to eat. I imagine she's laying down." "I must go and see her. I just know how to massage her neck and temples to relieve her muscular tensions. And luckily," the elderly woman added, producing a bottle from her shoulder bag, "I've brought along some of my herbal restorative. It always does the poor dear so much good." Before Nancy could object or stop her, Ethel Bossany went striding up the staircase from the great hall and along the upper floor gallery toward the Penvillins' private suite. Lisa was resting on a chaise longue, but she seemed glad to see her visitor and was soon relaxing under the ex-games mistress's skilled touch. Would you be kind enough to fetch a glass from the bathroom, dear?" Ethel said to Nancy, "so she can sip some of my herb cordial." A thought occurred to the teen sleuth. Could something in the herbal concoction be affecting Lisa's health? Nancy glanced through the medicine cabinet and picked out a small bottle of aspirin. She removed the tablets and rinsed out the bottle, then poured in some of the cordial, capped the bottle again, and slipped it into her pocket. When Nancy returned, Ethel was crooning gently as she massaged Lisa's head. From the latter's contented smile, it appeared that Miss Bossany's ministrations were having the desired effect. Ethel took the glass of cordial, but before she could hold it to her patient's lips, Lisa's head sagged forward and her eyelids closed in slumber. "Let her sleep, poor lamb," Ethel murmured, "but when she wakes up, be sure she drinks some of this." After Ethel left, Nancy poured out the concoction. At dinner, Lisa appeared more cheerful and in better spirits. Hugh, however, was grim-faced and taciturn. Nancy did her best to keep up a flow of conversation, but she was still so depressed over the tabloid news stories it was hard to maintain a smiling front. Nancy wrote several letters home that evening, then read a novel till she drifted off to sleep. Her dreams were troubled, and she tossed and turned. Suddenly her eyes opened, and she sat upright. A creaking noise echoed from the corridor. What on earth is that? Nancy wondered. Her bedside travel clock showed 1:17 a.m. She threw back the covers, swung her feet to the floor, pulled on a robe and slippers. Then she peered out of her room down the hall. At a bend in the corridor, a door stood ajar. Nancy could feel a faint, cold draft coming through it. That's the tower door, she reflected. Its creaking hinges indicated that it was seldom used. Why would anyone be going up there now? Curious, Nancy snatched a penlight from her bag and hurried down the hall. Beyond the door, ancient stone steps spiraled upward. She mounted them silently. Suddenly, Nancy stopped short, wide-eyed, as she glimpsed a gowned, barefooted figure above her. It was Lisa. Nancy called out to her softly, but got no response. "Lisa?" she repeated in a louder voice. Her friend continued up the tower stairs. She's walking in her sleep, Nancy realized. Her own skin chilled to gooseflesh at the eerie sight. More curious than ever, and uncertain whether or not to wake her friend, Nancy followed step by step. The climb was exhausting, yet Lisa showed no sign of awakening. She passed a door, which Nancy could see through a window in the tower wall, led out onto a walkway along the battlements. Evidently, she was heading for the very top of the tower. At last she emerged onto the stone roof. Nancy, following her, could see the notched stone parapet surrounding them in the moonlight. Lisa walked straight toward one of the notches. A gasp of horror rose in Nancy's throat as she suddenly sensed her friend's intention. Nancy choked off the sound before it reached her lips for fear of waking and startling Lisa into losing her balance. Already Lisa was climbing up into the embrasure or opening in the parapet. Another moment and the sleepwalker would be poised to step off into empty air. Nancy's heart was thudding in panic. What to do? There was no time to reason out the wisest course. Acting on blind instinct, she rushed forward and grabbed Lisa around the waist. For a second, both girls tottered perilously as Nancy struggled to restrain her friend. Then Lisa seemed to go limp, and the two girls sagged backward to safety, collapsing on the stone roof of the tower. Footsteps were pounding toward them. As the mist of terror cleared from Nancy's eyes, she became aware of a man bending over them. It was Hugh, clad in pajamas and robe, his face still aghast at the heart-stopping drama that had just taken place. "Lisa! Lisa, darling!" he exclaimed in a voice hoarse with emotion. "Thank God you're all right!" He gathered his young wife tenderly in his arms as if she were a child. Tall and powerfully built as he was, Nancy had wondered earlier if he might be capable of violence when provoked by rage or opposition to his wishes. There was no sign of any such tendency in his nature right now. Never had his deep love for Lisa seemed more apparent. He murmured words of gratitude to Nancy, then with his wife in his arms he strode across the roof and started back down the stone steps. Nancy paused to peer down through the notch in the parapet. The sheer drop to the rocky ground below almost left her giddy. Would Lisa have gone over the brink, or would some instinct of self-preservation have awakened her in time? The very thought of what could have happened made Nancy feel sick. As she turned away, her eyes caught a distant glimmer of light. It was coming from a point somewhere west of the castle. Peering intently, she could make out a tall smokestack in the moonlight. The engine house of the old abandoned tin mine. Nancy felt a surge of excitement. She hurried after Lord Penvillin and followed him down the tower stairs. In the doorway of the couple's room, she hesitated uncertainly as he deposited his still sleeping wife on the bed. "Can I help in any way?" "I think she'll be all right now, thank you," Hugh replied. "I can't tell you how grateful I am to you, Nancy, for saving Lisa." He was clearly unused to making such emotional speeches and spoke in a tone of gruffly awkward sincerity, adding with a shudder, "My God, when I think what might have happened. Has she ever sleepwalked before? Not that I'm aware of, but who can say?" Hugh shrugged helplessly. "I don't usually wake up at night, but she must have made some slight noise in leaving the room. I awoke, and when I discovered Lisa was gone, I ran out into the hall and saw the tower door was open." After talking a while longer, Nancy returned to her own room, but instead of going back to bed, she put on a sweater and jeans. Then, after waiting and listening to make sure no one else was up and about, she stole quietly out of the castle. Lisa's bicycle was leaning against a wall of the courtyard. Nancy mounted it and pedaled off into the darkness. A chilly breeze was blowing in from the sea, making her glad she had worn her sweater. The moon had slipped behind a veil of clouds, but there was light enough to see her way. She took the road that ran near the castle and followed it to the paved highway leading west to Penzance. When she neared the mine's engine house, Nancy turned off the highway. She parked the bike among some trees and started on foot toward the smokestack, which was visible not far off. Soon the engine house itself came in sight, but she was approaching a blank wall of the old stone building. Nancy circled about till she could see a window. A light still gleamed from within. Not a sound broke the night's silence, save for the distant beat of surf on the rocky coast. At last, Nancy ventured closer and peered in the window. The light was coming from a lantern, but there was no one inside. The door opened readily. Nancy wrinkled her nose in distaste as she entered. The interior reeked of incense and marijuana. On the floor lay a broken hypodermic syringe and scattered marijuana butts, indicating recent drug use. But there were other signs that interested her even more. One was a 5-sided figure painted on the floor, the magic pentacle that witches and wizards stand inside when summoning the occult forces of darkness. On the wall were chalk marks that she recognized as witch symbols. In this part of Cornwall, it seemed drug use was closely allied with witchcraft. Suddenly, Nancy froze as she heard a faint, strange melody in the distance. The music had a thin, piping quality like an Irish tin whistle playing an old folk tune. But where could it be coming from in such a lonely spot this late at night? Nancy felt a chill of fear. Were the cultists and drug users who were in the engine house earlier still lurking nearby? And if they were, had they seen her? She went out again and peered into the darkness. The moonlight was too dim to see very far, but the piping sound seemed to be coming from the west. She didn't want to use the lantern from the engine house. That would advertise her approach. Better rely on her little purse pin light, Nancy decided. She started cautiously toward the sound, wondering what she would find. From what she could recall about the landscape she had glimpsed while being driven from the station to the castle, there was nothing out this way but bleak, uninhabited moorland. Nancy proceeded, step by step, flicking on her pin light now and then to avoid obstacles. The piping sound was moving too, she sensed, drawing her onward. A pang of mistrust shot through her. Suddenly her feet squelched into sticky muck. She tried to back out, only to sink still deeper. Nancy floundered wildly, but the effort only sank her ankle deep into the muck. With a gasp of terror, she realized, I've just walked into a quicksand bog. End of chapter 12. This is the edgiest Nancy Drew book ever, and they have changed a billion things before they made it into Curse of Blackmore Manor. Okay, let me catch up. I do know I have till July, but I don't want to... I'll forget about it if I don't just get it done. Yeah. Only one more chapter? If you're getting a refund, there's no reason to delay except that it's a pain, which is why I still haven't done mine. Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna get a refund or have to owe, but I need to do them anyway. Someone actually announces Ethel? She isn't just creeping up on everyone? V is woman. The suspense. No key without toil, no fire without oil. Appropriate music is appropriate, and not anymore. That sometimes happens. Hi, Sunny. Thank you for the host. Hope you're having a great day. In case you missed the memo, I'm reading the book that The Curse of Blackmore Manor was based off of, and it's very, very different. There's lots of Nancy kissing British rock stars, and cocaine, and drugs, and witchcraft, and it's craziness. Thank you for shouting out Sunny and HS. I collected a lot of the devil's lettuce on our island. Yeah, my pockets was full of weed. Step by step, day by day. Muck is a Pokemon. Yeah, my Splatoon Sunday stream was great. Last Dance with Mary Jane. It's going well, Sunny. I hope you're doing well. I know, it is a lot. Thank you for the claps. Thank you for the claps. Yeah, for now, that's the end of the stream. I might come back later today, but like I said, I have a to-do list I need to get through at home. So if I get all that done in great time and there's nobody else streaming, I might jump back with some Pokemon later today. Yeah, it was a lot of weed. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you so much for being here. The next time we do a read stream, we'll finish this book up and see how all of this ends up connecting to what we know now as The Curse of Blackmore Manor, but Breen's Wig Hacker. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Take care of yourselves this week. I hope if you're working, that work is smooth. For those of you who've had everything canceled, for those of you who are quarantined or staying home to, slow the spread, I just hope that everything this week goes great for you, that you guys stay happy, healthy, and safe. I hope to see you all again soon. Take care, and bye-bye.